Hi everybody, this is Leo Vallant and this is part one of my two-part series, The Power of Mythology. In part one, we'll be discussing some of the consequences our civilization has had to deal with in moving away from a mythological matrix of cultural traditions and beliefs into a rational mode, while confining ourselves mostly to issues of health. Then, in part two, we'll speak of the possibility that in our future machine intelligence and robotics age, that for the good of the health and welfare of humanity, materialistic cynicism will be abandoned and some new optimized mythological framework embraced. Yes, I know it doesn't make any sense now, but that just means we have a lot of talking to do. So let's get started on part one. We always hear about what we've gained from our great age of science, but do we ever stop to think about what we've renounced for it? Yes, there was one instance in time when the fledgling age of reason first started casting its creeping shadow over the age of faith, when science seemed to make its deal with the devil and we traded away our aesthetically keyed minds and spirits for the benefits of only those things we could weigh in some sterile scientific scale. Well, let's recall that moment, along with the memory of the great man it involved, Franz Mesmer. It happened just a few years before the French Revolution would kill off both God and the king, sending the world reeling into over 2 centuries of chaos, with predatory winner-take-all capitalism, almost an endless cycle of wars, and the tumultuous anarchy of unrestricted competing self-interests, and the paralyzing polarization of democracy, a form of government which believes that flaws are virtues, and believes it with an intensity of a quasi-religious fanaticism, even while it now leads us perhaps inexorably towards extinction. So yes, it was a time when numerous flaming torches were being thrown through the ground floor windows of our civilization, which yeah, it had grown somewhat decadent, but it was still the only civilization we had. Reform might have well been in order, but what we got was a revolution. Well, okay, but that's all really a big subject, isn't it? So, for now, rather than standing back and viewing all around us the general conflagration that ensued, well, let's just focus in on the fires related to Franz Mesmer and his animal magnetism. But yes, Franz Mesmer had set up a hugely successful and clinically effective medical practice in Louis XVI's France, using an elaborate and very impressive methodology he called animal magnetism. Well, the French doctors didn't appreciate being eclipsed and displaced, especially by a German, and so they petitioned their king to shut Mesmer down. So the king appointed a commission to see to it that some plausible reason could be found to pull Mesmer's medical license. Benjamin Franklin, an American, was then ambassador to France, representing the United States, and yes, Franklin was very famous at the time, and on behalf of the USA, Franklin did in fact owe the French king a huge favor for having sent a French fleet that had boxed in the British fleet at Jamestown, thus winning the Americans' Revolutionary War for them. And so it was that the French king, assured of Franklin's pliability, appointed him to be chairman of the commission that was dedicated to Mesmer's destruction. But Franklin, to his credit, was fairly discreet and measured about it, given the constraints of the foregone conclusion he was given to deliver, concluding in his commission's judgment that while Mesmer was clearly then the most successfully effective doctor in all of France, that there remained the problem that his animal magnetism couldn't be isolated, quantified, or pinned down to any provenly axiomatic set of known facts. Their complaint wasn't so much that Mesmer misrepresented the mechanism responsible for all his cures, as that they found no scientific means for contextualizing his explanation. And since they insisted on only being able to understand animal magnetism in their own terms, if at all, well, Mesmer was fixed to lose this battle. Also, we all sort of know that entrenched special interests often react to sweepingly successful innovations with accusations that the newcomers aren't playing fair. Yeah, it's kind of childish, but they do it anyway. So with Mesmer thinking independently of materialistic science, while hinging his animal magnetism on more ethereal causes, well, it was seen as somehow cheating, and they thought he needed to be stopped, not so much for his own good as for theirs. So yes, Franklin attacked the cause for all the cures while tipping his hat to all the beneficial medical effects that he'd be shutting down. Yes, this shimmer of animal magnetism, even while plotting its palliative hoofprints up and down the Champs-Élysées, was declared to be unreal because science refused to see it. And I believe it was at least partially because the men on the committee who never understood it also couldn't prove it, and really, they had no incentive to try. And we should keep in mind that God himself, or herself or itself, along with all of the purely aesthetic foundations for any kind of a civilized social morality, well, all of that kind of stuff and anything else in our lives that sparkles with unquantifiable mystery, all of it would also have been tossed out by Franklin's commission, and for the very same reasons that science would reject anything it couldn't or wouldn't care to explain. So materialism defaulted into becoming the only ideology that science could endorse.
What we know of today as hypnotism was derived from only a part of what Mesmer had developed. Hypnotism started out as mesmerism. But be that as it may, today's hypnotism is really very much held back by its modern scientific context. You know, that it's some trick, and that in order to be effective, hypnotism must first submerge itself under the defenses of a relentlessly critical and conflicted modern mind, going down to what we call our subconscious mind. But think about what Mesmer enjoyed back in the twilight days of his age of faith, when what we call the subconscious mind was still churning and bubbling up upon the surface, where even just a touch of awe and wonder would have been plenty enough to fully entrance the ordinary man or woman. People's minds and psyches were still largely open. It would take science and modern cynicism to close them down, and we went from an age of faith into an age of doubt and moral uncertainty. But yes, after Mesmer's doom became irrevocable, Franklin himself had been cornered into better explaining all of Mesmer's cures. And after having become more familiar with mesmerism, well, he largely gave back with one hand what he had taken away with the other. That is, Franklin attributed the cures of animal magnetism and the wonders of hypnotism to the power of suggestion. And in renaming Mesmer's chimera, well, that was apparently enough to domesticate it. But wouldn't we then suppose that science would have then studied this now certified power of suggestion to discover all its possibilities and to realize all their great potential? But no, that didn't happen, and I guess we can see why. That once science tossed Mesmer out into the cold outer darkness, well, who among the other geeks and nerds of the time would have stood up in his place? Yeah, sides had to be chosen. One can stand with one's profession and affluence, or stand alone in poverty. The scientific community and the medical profession, then as now, was characteristically insular, stodgy, and conservative. And besides, you know those people are all borderline autistic anyway, aren't they? And if they're not autistic as individuals, well, their professional culture behaves autistically, doesn't it? So the idea of investigating the power of suggestion by studying the effects of human interactions and situational perceptions on the healing process, well, it must have seemed to this stodgy and diffident scientific community as being a little bit too much like taking a walk on the wild side. Yeah, just like with anything else that involves personal interactions and people's feelings, it'd be too far outside their cold professional autistic comfort zones. So yeah, instead of seeing if the power of suggestion could help, well no, they went in completely the other direction, where they attempted to control for and minimize the power of suggestion. Any beneficial effects of suggestion would be rejected as redundant to the benefits of whatever material science was used in the surface treatment. You know, the pills or whatever. Then, soon, within decades of Franklin's ruling, the power of suggestion was translated into the more clinical, Latinized term, the placebo effect. Yeah, I had to look it up. It's from the Latin, but it sounded Greek to me. But when we think about the placebo effect today, well, it's typically just a few percentage points greater than nothing at all. We can only scratch our heads and wonder about how anybody could ever have once thought that the power of suggestion was so threateningly powerful. But we forget how flamboyantly theatrical Franz Mesmer was in asserting his suggestion, where animal magnetism was being presented in an elaborate show with pools of chemically treated colored waters mingled with fragrances, and ropes of specially braided precious metal strands, along with elaborate coils of wire with antennas, phosphorescent lights, bells, incense, incantations, everything but the stained glass windows from the Notre Dame Cathedral and a modern laser light show. Yes, in an age where there were already so few defenses guarding the subconscious mind, well, what remained would have been completely overwhelmed by the conceptual sublimity. And that was Mesmer's animal magnetism. But today they kill all positive suggestion in a stifling atmosphere of unrelieved, cautious, and conservative prognoses. Just listen to what they tell sick or dying experimental subjects in drug testing trials, that they're going to receive either a medicine that is still just only being tested and so they don't know whether it will work or not, or that they'll receive a placebo, that is, some inert pill that's purpose-made to do absolutely nothing at all for them. Yeah, the only suggestion I see in all that is that their lives don't matter. Wouldn't it be more likely that people would just give up altogether after the doctors they want so much to trust give them a speech like that? Yes, this may be the very reason why we hear of so many really squirrely outlier side effects, which are probably just the direct effects of the demoralization being administered by the medical community on these poor, desperate, and confused test subjects. Yeah, it kind of proves that just being with doctors nowadays is enough to make people sick. Kind of a placebo effect in reverse, isn't it? Yeah, how ironic that what they don't want working for them ends up working against them. But what if the same dynamics still apply now as in the days of Mesmer? That the power of suggestion could still outperform material medicine? Or at least significantly augment its effectiveness? Are we really just willing to throw away all that extra healing power? Why not lean into the placebo effect and the power of suggestion and put it all to positive use? But yeah, I've talked to some doctors that do wish to be more successful in their practices, and so they work in such a way as to have the placebo effect in their corner, with the winds at their backs. So what they do, when they feel they can legally get away with it, is they insist to their patients that their treatments will undoubtedly make them better, without clawing any of it back by citing statistical probabilities and all the reservations or provisos that involve their patient's baseline health, age, weight, or any of the other health factors that most doctors cite nowadays in order to seemingly sow doubt and confusion. Yes, these good doctors, going all in with the placebo effect, with their priority on healing, well, they just want their patients to walk out the door with just one splendidly consistent golden vision of health and wellness shining in their mind's eye and cherished in their hearts, so it'd be almost like they're feeling better already. And these doctors, while not as theatrical as Mesmer, well, they do try to make the best show they can of it. They have their patients wait in treatment rooms that are practically wallpapered with prestigious diplomas, and they present themselves in all their gray-hair glory, dignified in their pristine starch-white lab coats, and with nurses at their sides, smiling on with serene, loving, and almost divine encouragement. The same way we remember our mothers doing when we had been feeling hurt, helpless, or frightened. The same way we feel in the doctor's offices now, don't we? And just like we could expect, such cheating, as Benjamin Franklin would have called it, well, it does get results. The patients do begin feeling better almost immediately. Yes, then we hear of all those doctors without borders who take their medical wares to the undeveloped world, and well, I hear they often find the semi-primitive, unscientific atmosphere to be refreshing. That is, if their tents are set to be upwind of the open septic systems. But yes, if these doctors can find the flexibility to adapt to the local voodoo cultures or whatever, well, they could really make it work for them. Or at least they can breathe a little easier once they're away from all the predatory scavenging lawyers in our world. Yes, we must be living in a really sick society where the lawyers wield so much more power than our doctors. But yes, while the modern medicines and procedures are certainly effective, well, there arises the problem of how these doctors without borders can contextualize their treatments in cultures where the previous attending physicians had been shamans or witch doctors. Should the Western doctors barge in and create a crisis of faith by denouncing the local traditions and thereby provoke the reaction of a class of enemies and detractors? Or do they go in seeking a partnership, remembering that eventually they're all going to go home, and patient care will revert back to the witch doctors, who may be the only doctors these people will have to turn to? And then we need to remember that, just as Franz Mesmer proved to the world 200 years ago, that if the mythological mindset of a people remains unshaken, then the power of suggestion can be a very effective medicine, even just by itself. Then we should consider just how little money it would take to persuade the witch doctors to sit on the same side of the table as the doctors, showing the people a united healthcare front. Yes, and here we need to keep in mind that humanity is not some ideal, but the actual people we see standing before us. And to the vast majority of people, we can assert that two contradictory statements are both true. And if nobody points out the problem with that, then most people would not have any trouble at all in believing it. Yes, discerning contradictions is higher order thinking, which requires more intelligence than most people have or would care to use even if they had it. Also, ordinary people typically don't have a second thought after their acknowledged leaders signal to them what they're expected to think. Remember, it's more important for these people at the animal instinctual level to belong unquestionably to their social groups than to be philosophically or intellectually correct. Then we also need to remember of most people everywhere nowadays that it's only by our presently accepted de facto mythology, held by both humanists and spiritualists alike, that we believe in humanity as some kind of an idealized semi-divine set of creatures that reside above the lower and lesser animal kingdom. But if we were ever stripped of that myth, well, we'd only be primates dressed up and wearing shoes, wouldn't we? And yeah, if we really are all materialists now, well, don't you think it's about time we stopped pretending and deal with our reality realistically and stop thinking better of ourselves than we have any rational right to deserve? So, of course, many of our behaviors are more animal instinctual than rational. And so the Doctors Without Borders would be wise to just do their jobs and let the local leaders worry about all the mind control considerations. And if they don't bring up all the logical contradictions that occur to them, well, nobody else will either. Keep in mind that cohesive social groups just want to get along, and as long as you go along, you'll get along too. So yeah, when the Doctors Without Borders manage to play it right, it really makes their jobs easier, which is a considerable consolation they have for the many hardships, discomforts, and inconveniences they must accept while away from home on their humanitarian missions. You know, knowing that they couldn't possibly thrive over there, but hoping only to endure. And God bless them for it. We really do have so few selfless saints nowadays. Oh, and yes, the scientific atmosphere today is corrosively all-pervasive, even outside the hospitals and doctors' offices. For instance, there's always some faith healers traveling around. No, not as many as years gone by, but they're still out there. They're often the main attraction at Christian revivalist tent shows and evangelical get-togethers. And yes, they go to great lengths to present compelling and convincing shows, though not nearly on the same scale as Mesmer, who had all his elaborate animal magnetism stagings and props. But yeah, the faith healer's appeal is more along religious lines, similar to voodoo, where it's all the prayer, song, and dance that puts the crowd into a trance. But yeah, while it may be just a matter of taste, I think that voodoo has more soul. But, as I said, there's no escaping the age of science's cynical ambiance. And unlike during the days of Mesmer, and indeed all through the medieval period, when saints such as Vincent Ferrer were bringing about total and lasting remissions, well, nowadays the tent show healers, as a rule of thumb, give themselves just 3 days to get out of town. To maybe give themselves a good head start on anybody who'd want to try to catch them. Really, people often donate great amounts of money in gratitude for being relieved of illness or any kind of lameness. But well, later, it might make them very angry that they weren't told that their healings would be timed out using a 72-hour clock. Well, we need to ask ourselves why and how the power of suggestion has gotten to be so short-term. I think there might be 2 main reasons why healings unwind. Firstly, and most obviously, well, I would think it's because doubt inevitably sets in. Just the idea that their healings seem too incongruent, too extraordinary for them, in the context of the general pessimism of their ordinary nihilistically modern lives. Well, couldn't that be enough to shut down the positive effects of a suggestion? Yeah, I suppose people brought up in today's society can't honestly believe they're all that special enough to be deserving of some miraculously perfect health. It just seems more normal to be sick than well, which really would be the very definition of a toxic society, wouldn't it? And besides, talking about definitions, well, miracles never used to be defined as being impossible as they are today. No, it only meant that these healings were from God. The second reason why faith healings by suggestion might be unraveling is, well, I think that the mythological foundations being used are structurally lacking somehow, in such a way that the suggestions aren't complete or inclusive enough. Somehow not dotting all the necessary I's or crossing all the essential T's. That they're not touching far enough down upon the crucial points that lay deep within us. Yeah, I'm suggesting here that the functionally effective mythologies can't be arbitrary, but that they need to form a kind of veritable organic spiritual connection or resonance to the people they serve. So yeah, it may be useful to go back to study Mesmer's methodologies to discern what he had been doing right. But I can guess at what modern faith healers are doing wrong, and that it may be that assigning the healings to a particular individual or entity, such as Jesus Christ, is so contingent on faith that the key becomes too clunky to turn in the lock. I think that the suggestion would work better if some universal free and unconditional energy were invoked. Some energy not so dependent upon the gatekeepings of a religious purity and the approval of small-town church biases and bigotries, where Jesus is often presented as being judgmental, selective, vindictive, and nowadays even political. Oh, and a word about faith. Yes, innocent faith, the kind that's passed down to us from our mother's knee and that's never been credibly questioned, well, that can be effective as long as it's mythologically sound. But no, we can't take cynical knowledge and try to paint over it with some new belief system, because a natural cynicism from our other acquired beliefs will always bleed through. And such attempts to raise faith out of doubt is only futile wishful thinking and creating a guilty mental conflict more than anything else, which, yeah, that may be the real point, as the pastors can use their parishioners' guilt against them as a kind of a control mechanism. But there is one exception I can think of in regards to my assertion that faith can never overcome doubt. You see, if we're willing to go to the almost life or death extreme, as some cults are willing to do, of using physical and emotional trauma to induce a total nervous breakdown, then the personality can be almost entirely dissolved and then reformulated into a kind of overly simplistic but very faithful zombie-like individual. Yeah, see my video series, The Material Mechanics of Spirituality, where I explain all that exhaustively. But yes, it occurs to me now that both religious healings and religious morality can't work out of the same office, because when they do, our faith is often overshadowed by our guilt, and faith is a flower that wilts in the shade. And so we feel we don't deserve to be healed. Therefore, I would suppose that healing would require the invocation of its own specialized patron saints and angels, known as much for their open-mindedness as for their healing prowess. And it can be left exclusively to the angels of righteousness and vengeance to be made of the sterner, stricter stuff. So yes, this suggests another instance of my hypothesized suggestion that we can expect that not all mythologies are equally effective or effective for everything. So, a mythology that applies only to the religious temperament, well, we can see that it'd be leaving a great many people out in the cold, right? That's why there's so much to be admired in the old pagan mythologies, with their multiple gods, meaning multiple personality ideals, where their blessings were distributed across a far wider and more inclusive demographic. You know, we only want people not to be killing each other, right? But it's okay if some people party a lot and that type of thing, you know, isn't it? But yes, in summing up this part one, well, no, there can be no return to our lost mythological innocence, can there? Our worldview, as it stands now, is built upon a mountain of past memories chock full of materialistic cynicism, and we just can't hit delete or do a reset to get out of all that. There's no way we can get around that we know what to expect and that it's not good and that we actually do have a kind of faith, but it's not the good kind. No, maybe we should call it an anti-faith. It's a scientific faith in hopeless nihilism, a faith that we live in a cold, cruel, callously materialistic universe. Don't we all remember the little talk we got when we were about 5, 6, or 7 about how there isn't really a Santa Claus? Well, there's no taking any of that back. We can't unring that bell or any of the other bells that the general scientific sterile bleakness rings in our head. No, the magic's over. The age of innocence is lost to us forever. Or maybe not. Let's continue on to part 2, where we can talk about some future possibilities. Thanks, everybody. Hey, part 2 might take a while. It's over 40 of these paragraphs in 2 or 3 days. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Take care.